Welcome to the realm of science fiction, where imagination knows no bounds and extraordinary stories unfold. Enjoy the adventure. Luraith pulsed beneath twin lavender moons, its jungles alive with veins of glowing blue and violet. The trees, tall spindled things with translucent bark, whispered in the wind, releasing spores like stars scattered into night. Rivers ran, thick with liquid bioluminescence, coiling through dense forests that shimmered in time with unseen rhythms. The atmosphere, heavy with charged ions, refracted light in delicate arcs, casting chromatic halos across the sky. Every breath Elias took tasted of ozone and floral nectar, an intoxicating blend that didn't quite belong to nature as he knew it. Above him, fractured clouds shimmered with shifting colors, and the world hummed beneath his boots as if the ground itself breathed. Luraith wasn't just a planet. Kate was a phenomenon, a biosphere engineered or born with intention, and in its surreal beauty lay something else, a presence, watching, waiting. Humanity had come here to study, but Luraith, it seemed, was already studying them. Elias carried silence like armor. Behind sharp eyes and steady hands lived a man who once believed understanding was enough. But understanding had failed him. On Virilan 9, where a handshake misread became a massacre. The cost of curiosity had been blood. His mission, once fueled by hope, now crawled forward under the weight of guilt. He didn't speak of what happened. He didn't have to. It lingered in the way he avoided mirrors, the way he flinched at celebratory words like breakthrough or peace. He studied alien cultures with surgical precision, always at a distance. No bonds, no trust, just data. Redemption wasn't something he expected. Survival was enough. But something inside him still burned. A flicker of that old belief that maybe, just maybe, connection was still worth the cost. And so he walked among the bioluminescent wilds of Luraith, a ghost haunted not by death, but by the chance to feel again. The tranquil pulse of Luraith turned hostile without warning. Drones cloaked in refracted light emerged from the canopy, weaving nets of plasma-laced current around him. Paralysis followed. Not pain, just an eerie stillness, like being frozen in thought while the world moved on. When consciousness returned, light bled through opaque walls. Alien figures hovered, not with menace but sterile curiosity. Their eyes, unblinking slits of refracted crystal, did not meet his. Instead, they scanned. No name, no introduction. Just a low, synchronized hum and a label etched into the data stream. Specimen 113H. Not Elias, not human. Just an anomaly filed under emotional unpredictability. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a threat. He was something worse. An unknown variable. And in their world of calculated thought and empathic precision, unknowns were dangerous. So they studied him. And in the silence between scans, he wondered if they feared what they might find. The enclave was alive, but not with warmth. Walls flowed like glassy muscle, pulsing faintly with internal light. Corridors twisted in unnatural symmetry, guided by logic instead of comfort. Every surface shimmered with organic circuitry, humming in rhythms too precise to be accidental. The air smelled of minerals and memory. Ivalari scientists moved without speaking, their thoughts braided in silence. Communication flowed like current between them, efficient, exact, without waste. Their eyes glowed dimly, not from light, but from the reflection of shared thought. Elias stood behind a translucent wall, no bars, no locks, only separation. Every movement was logged, every breath measured. They did not touch, they did not threaten, they simply observed. To them, he was not a person. He was a pattern, something to decode. And as he watched them watching him, he realized the most terrifying truth of all: he might never be seen. She entered like a shadow that refused to vanish. No grand gesture, no sound, just presence. Taller than the others, cloaked in layered organic fibers that shifted hue with her thoughts, Valith radiated stillness. Her gaze didn't flicker, it dissected, not in cruelty, but in hunger for comprehension. She observed Elias like one might observe a dangerous artifact, too alien to trust, too fascinating to ignore. Her fingers never touched the glass, yet it pulsed when she neared. Devices calibrated to measure emotional variance sparked to life at her command. She watched him flinch at memories, noted the subtle tightening of his jaw at silence, the clenched breath when shown images of Earth. She spoke only to clarify anomalies, Words were tools, not bridges. Emotion to her was a flaw in the data. And yet she lingered. Long after the scans stopped, long after others left, she stayed. Her silence stretched not like judgment but curiosity, the kind that studies storms not for the destruction they bring, but for what they reveal when the sky splits open. To Elias, she was the only one who looked at him and didn't flinch. To her, he was the question no algorithm could solve. The question came not as command, but curiosity. No authority, no accusation, just a thread pulled loose in the fabric of silence. Her voice, less sound than sensation, passed through the interface like breath on glass. Not translated, understood. Why do you resist connection? He didn't answer. At first, the words felt too thin for what pulsed beneath his skin, because connection meant surrender, and surrender on Virelin 9 had been the first step to slaughter. The memory was carved into the marrow of his instincts. She pressed nothing, only waited. No readings, no scans, just presence. He finally spoke, the syllables slow and shaped by something older than caution. Because you don't ask to know, you ask to dismantle. Something shifted. A pause. A resonance like surprise. That was not data. That was belief. She didn't argue. Instead, she asked something else. Not with words, through thought, carefully shaped and offered like a gift. What would it mean? To be understood, without being broken? He didn't answer, but the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed, unsteady, unfamiliar, alive. They began with memory triggers, artificial reconstructions crafted from fragmented data pulled from his ship's logs and psychological profile, childhood laughter in the background of a burning village, a sibling's smile twisted by time and guilt, the taste of copper on his tongue as command dissolved into chaos. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. Next came neural simulations, wrapped in flawless logic loops, designed to corner emotion with precision. He was shown alternate timelines where he chose differently, where the mission on Virelin 9 didn't end in fire, where they lived, where the children were never caught in the crossfire. Regret was expected. Collapse was predicted. Instead, silence. Even artificial dream injections failed. His mind twisted them, corrupted the projections. The dreamscape refused to cooperate. Logic spiraled into paradox. Grief didn't fit into their equations. The machine stuttered, the observers recalibrated, and still they could not map the shape of his sorrow. What they had not accounted for, what they could not quantify, was that Elias did not resist the pain. He lived inside it. It shaped him, armored him, turned him into something incompatible with their expectations. He was not a broken circuit. He was a storm they couldn't simulate. And somewhere behind mirrored walls, one Ivalari watched it all and wondered, what kind of species survives this and still chooses to feel? Protocols were not broken on Luraith, not by the Ivalari, not by Valith until him. The deep link command bypassed 3 layers of security, her neural signature forced into override, a crime without violence, a violation without blood. But the moment it connected, the weight of her decision dissolved under something far heavier. Elias's mind did not unfold. It erupted, flashes of a ruined Earth colony under alien fire, a boy clinging to a dead brother's coat, the smell of smoke and iron, orders shouted and ignored, a diplomat's smile breaking just before the gunfire. There was no structure, no filter, only fragments, stitched together with pain and carried forward by a man too stubborn to collapse. And beneath, it all buried beneath grit and ruin, pulsed something she had no lexicon for: love. Not the Ivalari ideal of measured affection. This was wild, human, imperfect. It burned in memory and bled into silence. It made no sense, and yet it refused to be denied. She disconnected, gasping in thought, every sensory node in disarray. Her mind echoed with the remnants of his trauma, not like data, but like resonance. The taste of sacrifice still lingered. This wasn't a map. It was a battlefield, and she had just stepped into the ruins of a soul that had survived the unthinkable. And still chose to care. She didn't understand it, but she could no longer pretend it was a flaw. She had touched minds before, catalogued entire emotional spectrums, dissected grief, measured elation in controlled bursts. But this was different. This was not a study. This was immersion. She stumbled out of the link disoriented, her mental lattice flickering with dissonance. The data, no, the experience, clung to her like static. Colors with no spectral origin burned in her thoughts. Concepts bled into one another. Guilt braided with love, rage wrapped in sorrow, hope pressed between layers of despair like preserved flowers in ash. The Ivalari lexicon had no place for metaphor, no syntax for poetry, but now her mind itched with symbols that pulsed with meaning she could not decode. A burning tree, a cracked helmet filled with soil, a lullaby sung over broken bones. She didn't understand them, but she felt them, and in that feeling something shifted. She no longer referred to him as a specimen. That designation felt hollow now, an insult to the complex ruin she had just witnessed. He was still unpredictable, still alien, still dangerous, but now he was something else too. He was human, and in a culture built on the control of emotion, she had just taken the first step toward losing hers. She returned in silence. Unannounced, unrequired. No protocols authorized it, no reports justified it. But the link had opened something in her, and now that it had, the absence of his presence created a kind of ache, foreign, unfamiliar, unquantified. At first she asked questions, structured, clinical, designed to isolate variables. What triggers the grief? What sustains it? Why does music elicit emotional response in absence of semantic content? But the questions shifted, softened. They became not queries of a researcher, but of someone reaching. What does music feel like? Why do you grieve those you've already lost? Why does sorrow return when memory should suffice? Elias didn't trust easily, but her voice didn't press. Her curiosity didn't demand. So he answered, not with definitions or diagrams, but with stories. Fragments of earth layered in dusk. A melody hummed through broken comms in a collapsing outpost. The sound of a mother's laugh before she vanished into fire. He spoke not to explain, but to be heard, and for reasons she couldn't name, Valith listened. In those late hours, surrounded by walls built to divide, something else formed between them. Not alliance, not friendship, something quieter, unspoken. Connection born not from logic, but from lingering. And in a world that measured everything, that was the first thing they shared that refused to be measured. The Ivalari did not sleep near one another. Not in childhood, not in grief, not even in love, what their language once called it before they discarded the word for its instability. Physical closeness bred empathic bleed. Empathic bleed led to madness, so they engineered solitude into survival. Each mind was a sealed vault, and yet she lingered, not just in thought but in distance. Her presence began to defy the mathematically safe range, not by much, a step closer, a breath longer. Her silhouette etched into his peripheral vision with increasing consistency. He noticed, but didn't speak of it. He was a man accustomed to thresholds, how easily they collapsed. Through whispered questions and careful answers he learned the truth. Their emotional bonds had been cut out of them. A choice centuries ago to avoid war, to end chaos by ending closeness. She had never shared a room with anyone during rest. Now she sat beside the wall as sleep cycles passed unnoticed. Not a word exchanged, but something ancient stirred in the space between them. The beginning of fracture, not in structure, in silence, and in a culture built to avoid connection. That was the first step toward disobedience. He awoke with his pulse racing, breath shallow, drenched in the phantom heat of a fire that no longer burned. The echo of the nightmare still clung to him, ashes, blood, a name shouted too late. But he was not alone. Her body, alien and elegant, curled beside his, not watching, not analyzing, resting, breathing in rhythm with him, as if her mind had sought refuge in the very storm she once feared to touch. The surveillance grid showed nothing. No alerts, no logs. She hadn't come here with clearance. She had come with instinct. When asked later, she could offer no explanation. Only the admission that for the first time in memory, her thoughts had gone silent near him. No static, no noise, just stillness. He didn't ask her to leave. She didn't offer to. And in the silence that followed, something unspoken settled between them. Fragile, forbidden, and utterly alive. Patterns do not lie. Not in a society built on surveillance and synchronization. The circle noticed first, a shift in her neural logs, deviations in timing, prolonged proximity. She was still reporting, still uploading her findings, but the data was diluted, unfocused, laced with subtext. They questioned her directly. She answered with precision. Emotional integration requires longitudinal proximity. Prolonged exposure yields unfiltered variables. A clever defense, one rooted in scientific necessity. But the circle did not debate results. They measured intent, and Valith's readings had changed, subtly but irrevocably. Her neural cadence had slowed. Her empathic shield showed occasional flux. She had begun to feel without framework. They did not accuse her, not yet. But their silence shifted tone. The kind of silence that precedes judgment. Emotional entanglement with a human was not simply discouraged, it was an evolutionary threat, and the High Circle had never allowed threats to survive. Emotion for the Ivalari was once a toxin. A contagion of chaos passed through shared thought, but Elias wielded it like fire. Dangerous, yes, but illuminating. When she asked what grief felt like, he didn't define it. He told her about a boy who built a paper boat, only to watch it sink with his brother's name etched on the hull. He spoke of a song sung in a war zone, not to command but to remember. He called it metaphor. She called it inefficiency. But she listened. He read her ancient earth poetry, stanzas born of ruin and longing. She asked why the words didn't always make literal sense. He answered with a tired smile, because feeling isn't literal. In return, she shared fragments of pre-purged Ivalari history, texts marked forbidden, stories of bonded minds, of shared dreams, of empathy unshackled by structure. She spoke of a time when her people painted with thought and danced through shared emotion, before it was all stripped away in favor of control. She had never told anyone that. He did not ask. Her two together, they constructed a language without rules, an understanding forged in contradiction, pain that taught, beauty that scarred, memory that burned and built at once. What began as data exchange became something far less stable and far more powerful. And somewhere between the fire of Earth's myths and the silence of Ivalari truth, she began to see emotion not as a flaw, but as a form of memory that fought to survive. Luraith did not sleep. Even when still, it pulsed with life, not just biological, sentient. As Elias moved through its edges, granted limited freedom under observation, he began to notice the pattern. The way leaves shifted before he stepped, the hum beneath the roots, the tremor in his spine that didn't come from wind. He logged them in secret, small fluctuations in magnetic fields, strange oscillations in air pressure, psychic tremors too soft to register, but too consistent to ignore. Each shift felt less like a signal and more like a whisper. Not directed, not spoken, but felt. A presence not watching, but waiting. The land responded to emotion. That much he began to suspect. The terrain beneath him seemed calmer when his mind was at peace, more reactive when he remembered loss. The ground itself grew warm when Valith was near. He once thought the Ivalari had tamed this world. Now he wasn't so sure. There was no proof. Only instinct. But humanity had learned to trust the gut when instruments failed. He wasn't just walking through a planet. He was walking through something ancient, something that might be listening, and somewhere beneath all the roots and silence, it had started to listen to him. His presence cracked the air like frost. Where Valith had begun to bend, he remained unyielding, carved from the old algorithms, untouched by reform. Commander Therix wore silence like armor, each gesture deliberate, each word weaponized with precision. He was a relic, but relics still held power in a system afraid of ghosts. He spoke of duty, of lineage, of the foundational laws encoded into their evolution. The Ivalari had purged the chaos of emotion to survive, and she, Valith, now stood on the edge of betrayal. Empathic compromise, he called it, a contamination of thought brought on by prolonged proximity to the human. To him, Elias was not a variable. He was a contagion, and Valith had ceased to be immune. She didn't deny it. Not entirely, but silence, once her shield, failed to disguise the tension that pulsed just beneath her measured breath. Therix saw it. He reminded her of consequence, of the cleansing protocols still buried beneath the political reforms, of what happens when even one mind fractures the harmony. No raised voice, no violence, just the cold certainty of enforcement. He didn't have to say it, they were watching her now, and in a world where thought itself was no longer private, rebellion didn't start with words. It started with who you chose to feel for. The truth came not as confession but as fracture. Her voice faltered, not from shame but from the weight of memory too long denied. Once the Ivalari had loved, truly loved. They had sung in harmonic chords that echoed through jungle canopies, danced through dreams shared with unshielded minds. They had painted skies with emotion and carved empathy into every law, every ritual. Then came the sundering, a civil war unlike any before it, waged not for territory, but for truth. One side believed passion was strength, the other saw it as extinction. Empathy turned weapon, bonds became blades, minds fused and shattered, and in the aftermath, the victors rewrote the genome. Emotion was not purged, it was silenced. Neural. Filters, empathic dampeners. Generational edits passed like commandments. Passion became pathology, art became anomaly, solitude became law. Valith had only read fragments, hidden archives buried beneath doctrine. She was never meant to access them, but she had. And now, with Elias listening, she spoke the forbidden aloud. He didn't interrupt, he didn't console, he understood. They weren't incapable of feeling. They were afraid of it, because once it had almost destroyed them. But fear was not the absence of strength. It was the scar left by survival. And as she looked at him, this fragile human, defined not by perfection but persistence, she wondered if maybe what had once broken them could also be what healed them, if only they had the courage to try again. She wasn't supposed to dream, not like this, not the chaotic, image-laced torrents of human sleep. Ivalari dreams were structured, regulated, archived, thoughts filtered through biosystems that refined emotional debris into patterns. But this was not pattern, this was chaos. She stood beneath twin moons, their light washing over blood-slick stone. Elias lay broken at her feet, breath rattling, eyes wide and still. His voice, once so steady, called her name without sound. And in that moment, the scream rose not from him, but from her. Then fire, then silence, then waking. The tremors didn't fade with consciousness. She felt them in every motion, every scan, every breath. The memory of pain that hadn't happened, the fear of loss not yet real. These dreams bled into her thoughts during waking hours, coloring analysis, corrupting protocol. She ran diagnostics. Nothing biological, no malfunctions, no evidence of contamination. And yet the dreams persisted. She began avoiding sleep, but the visions found her even in rest mode stasis, uninvited, unfiltered, human in their violence, human in their meaning. They weren't warnings, they were emotions, her own, fear, longing, guilt. She wasn't observing the human anymore. She was feeling for him, and in a culture that prided itself on control, her loss of containment wasn't just dangerous, it was a declaration. Because if dreams were the mind's unspoken truth, then somewhere, in the depths of her genetically shielded psyche, she had already decided she could not lose him, even if it meant losing herself. The patterns were impossible to ignore. What began as curiosity turned into conviction, drawn in. Careful loops through pages of Elias's journal. Symbols from his dreams matched shifts in the terrain. Subtle changes in Luraith's bioluminescence mirrored emotional spikes. When he mourned, the leaves dimmed. When he laughed, the soil shimmered. He started recording pulse intervals, tracking how the earth itself seemed to breathe. Not randomly, not biologically, rhythmically. It wasn't just response, it was recognition. The forest's electromagnetic fields fluctuated in tandem with stress signals. Heat signatures clustered around him and Valith, especially during moments of emotional resonance. The closer they drifted to each other, the more erratic the planet's readings became, as if it too was reacting. As if it was watching. He considered the impossible. What if the entire biosphere wasn't just an environment? What if it was a consciousness? Luraith, with its glowing rivers and whispering trees, might not merely be alive, it might think. The terrain was a neural map. The bioluminescent pulses, synaptic. The planet wasn't just echoing back, it was speaking, not in language, not in sound, in feeling, and if it was aware of them, If it had truly begun to care, then Elias and Valith weren't just anomalies within its systems, they were variables it had chosen to keep. The verdict came not through trial but decree. The High Circle had watched long enough. Elias's presence was no longer considered research, it was infection, a contagion of empathy spreading beneath the surface of order. The neural shifts in Valith's pattern confirmed it. The link between them had gone too deep. He was no longer a specimen, he was a threat. Valith was summoned in silence, escorted through chambers carved from memory metal and ancient stone. No words of comfort were offered, just the weight of ancestral law pressing on every step. The circle seated in neural unity spoke as one: euthanize the human. Extract emotional signatures under the guise of final observation. Preserve what is useful, erase what is not. Failure to comply meant exile from caste, dissolution of title, emotional dismantling, a slow, clinical unraveling of her mind. No pain, no blood, just erasure. They did not ask for her opinion, they did not need it. But Elias heard the fragments through the walls, words half-filtered through ambient surveillance. Termination. Destabilization. Valith compromised. He did not confront her. He didn't need to. The silence between them that night screamed louder than anything else ever had. She stood outside his chamber longer than usual. He didn't sleep. Neither, so did she. Across the compound, Luraith's pulses grew erratic, echoing some primal awareness. The roots stirred beneath metal and stone. The air tasted like tension, like choice. They were standing on the edge now, not just of protocol, of extinction. Because the moment Valith chose him, the moment she refused the Circle's order, the Ivalari would have to decide if the future was something they could feel again, or something they'd destroy to stay numb. And that decision was no longer theoretical. It had a name, and it had just become her reason to defy everything. The command to obey was hardwired, ancestral. Generations of Ivalari had been bred to comply, their thoughts channeled through harmonized obedience. To defy the High Circle was not rebellion, it was neurological heresy, and yet she did. With one silent thought, Valith ruptured the bond. The psychic backlash detonated through the chamber, like a silent scream. Surveillance nodes burst in a shower of violet sparks. Neural inhibitors, long dormant, flared and failed. Protocol collapsed beneath the force of feeling unfiltered, raw, volatile, human. She shattered centuries with one act. The walls groaned, veins of light flickering like a wounded organism. Subroutines panicked. Emergency containment activated and failed. For the first time in 1,000 years, an Ivalari had broken the code not out of madness, but out of choice. They had given her one order. She gave them an answer. Not with words, not with argument, with resistance. Her mind burned with 1,000 cascading impulses: fear, clarity, grief, defiance. She felt them all, did not shield them. Let them roar through the compound like wildfire in a glass forest. Somewhere behind her, Elias rose, and for the first time, the one they called Specimen looked at a people who had dissected emotion for survival and saw one of them feel enough to fight for him. The chamber did not fall, the system did, and from its ruins a new rhythm began to pulse. Not code, heart. They fled into bioluminescent dark, chased not by weapons but by silence, a silence shaped like judgment, radiating from the shattered systems behind them. No alarms, no orders, just the void left when control collapses. Luraith. Opened before them, not in invitation, in instinct. Uncolonized regions surged with untamed beauty, spires of photosynthetic crystal, vines that pulsed with phosphorescent blood, ground that responded to every footfall with a shiver. Trees breathed, in unison. The light bent around them like memory. Bioenergy coursed beneath the soil in thick, rhythmic currents. A heartbeat. It wasn't a forest, it was a nervous system. The deeper they moved, the more the planet changed. Terrain shifted to guide them, subtle reroutes in pathing, blossoms. That opened not with sunlight but with thought. When Elias's pulse spiked, the roots around them coiled protectively. When Valith trembled, the air shimmered warm. She had never seen this part of her world. No Ivalari had, because Luraith had never allowed it. Not until now. They were no longer trespassers. They were being led, downward, inward, towards something ancient, buried beneath layers of biology and forgotten lore, a presence not confined to a chamber or throne, but spread across a planet like breath across lungs, and beneath every glowing stone and whispered wind, one truth pulsed louder than all the others. The planet had chosen them, not because they were perfect, but because they felt. And something beneath the surface was finally ready to feel back. The descent was not marked by gravity, but by gravity of meaning. Roots thick as memory coiled into passageways of light, descending in spirals that throbbed with warmth, fear, anticipation. Not a cavern, not a biome, this was infrastructure grown from thought. The deeper they moved, the more the world felt, less like terrain and more like trust. At the center waited no throne, no voice, only a lattice of glowing tendrils suspended in void. They pulsed softly at first, then with urgency. Valith reached out, not with hands but with mind. The link did not request permission, it welcomed her, and it hurt. The flood came instantly, visions that tore through her filters like sunlight through ice. The Ivalari War, cities of glass collapsing. Under empathic warfare, minds fractured by shared grief. The decision to sever emotion, the silence that followed, the sterility mistaken for peace, then rebirth. The tendrils pulsed brighter. She saw humans arriving. She saw chaos again, but not destruction. Emotion, wild and unstable, spreading like fire, and from it something new, an alliance forged in contradiction. Two species hand in hand or back to back in ruin, the outcome blurred, oscillating. It wasn't prophecy, it was choice. Elias stepped closer. His presence sharpened the vision, steadied it. Together their minds formed resonance, human chaos, Ivalari precision. Difference not as weakness but as fulcrum. The planet felt them both, and in its silent heartbeat it made one thing clear. It could not decide for them, but it would stand beside whatever they chose. The visions rose like tides, each more vivid than the last. Not dreams, not predictions, possibilities rendered in unbearable clarity. The planet, ancient and knowing, offered not commands but consequences. The first future burned red. Reawakened empathy spread like wildfire through the Ivalari. Bonds reforged, art reclaimed, love remembered. And then, civil war. Minds overwhelmed. By sensation once sealed away. Unity shattered by too much too fast. Cities fell, thought spiraled into madness. The scream of a species trying to feel again. And breaking under the weight of it. The second future withered grey. Emotion remained suppressed. Order preserved. The Ivalari endured for millennia. Unchanged, unchallenged, untouched. But beneath the surface, stagnation calcified their progress. Curiosity died. Culture froze. The species survived, but did not live. A garden tended too tightly, its roots strangled by safety. The third future flickered like starlight on water. Humans stood beside Ivalari, not above, not beneath, different, unpredictable, emotionally reckless, but present, not saviors, not threats, partners. Their passion bridged the numbness, not as invaders, but mirrors. The integration was slow, painful, fragile, but it held, it endured, it evolved. Valith felt each one, not through data but through grief, through longing, through hope so sharp it hurt. The planet asked for no oath, it demanded no pledge, but it waited. She was no longer just a xenopsychologist, no longer just a caste-bound observer. She was a living contradiction, what her people once were and might be again. Not a machine of logic, a being of choice. She turned to Elias, not for permission, but for clarity. In his expression she saw no demand, only trust, the kind that didn't command the future, the kind that believed in one. And for the first time in centuries, a member of the Ivalari made a decision not in fear, but in faith. They emerged not as fugitives, but as emissaries of something older than law, choice. Luraith's presence still echoed in their minds, a pulse of memory and emotion too vast for words. The core had not given them weapons, it had given them clarity. The world they returned to had not waited. Ivalarian forces stood in formation, armor humming with containment fields, plasma cannons poised, minds locked in sync, bound to doctrine. The fugitives had become variables. too dangerous to tolerate. The old order had been warned. It had chosen fear. Elias stepped forward. The warning came too late. A blast tore through the air, kinetic, precise. It caught him in the side, spun him to the ground. His breath left in a gasp that wasn't pain but disbelief. Blood bloomed against his shirt, stark and human and real. Vaylith did not scream. She burned. The suppression fields buckled before she moved. Her mind surged outward, not in violence, but in signal. She did not lash out. She invited them in. Not words, emotion. She broadcast grief, rage, hope, memory. And through it all, a single truth. He was not the threat. Their silence was. The enforcers staggered, not from damage, but feeling. For many, it was the first unfiltered thought they'd had. In their lives, a fracture raced through their formation, not in body but belief. The circle had sent weapons. Vaylith had brought fire. And somewhere beneath the blood-soaked dirt, Luraith stirred again. She moved before thought could catch her. Not away. Toward her. Body covered his instinct overriding design. There was no calculation, no protocol. Only motion born of something her species had rewritten out of itself. Protect. Not preserve data, not optimize outcome. Just protect. The next blast struck. Her spine. Pain, pure and untempered, tore through her nervous system. Her mental shielding fractured, not just around her but across the entire Ivalari psychic grid. The scream wasn't sonic, it was psychic, and it reached everyone, from the enforcers in orbit to the circles seated in unity, from the city cores to the outer stations. They felt it. Pain without filter, love without logic, terror not silenced but shared. The raw, unpermitted flood of a single being refusing extinction, not for herself but for him. Millions flinched, and something cracked. Not a wall, not a law, a belief. For 1,000 years they had sculpted their minds to reject the chaos of feeling. But in that moment the chaos became a beacon. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The message screamed across every mind, he matters, and so do we. He bled into the soil, heartbeat fading, breath shallowing. She collapsed beside him, her psychic threads frayed and flickering. Their minds, once separate, now pulsed in tandem, broken, but not defeated. Luraith responded, the ground lit from beneath, veins of light spreading through stone and root like a planetary inhale. The sky dimmed, the wind stilled. The planet was not watching. It was waiting. Across the networked minds of the Ivalari, something foreign moved. Memory that wasn't theirs. A dream shared by a world. The vision from the core, 3 futures echoed outward. Not as myth but invitation. No commands, just the choice. Some fell to their knees trembling. Others dropped weapons, weeping without understanding why. Children clutched their heads, feeling things no teacher had ever named. Elders stared into the sky and did not speak. The silence spread, not empty, heavy, full. Because for the first time in centuries a question had been asked, not by rulers, but by reality itself. Will you feel again? The world held its breath, waiting for the answer. He awoke to the scent of scorched earth and blooming soil. Pain bloomed first, dull, insistent. Then sound, then breath, his own, still moving, still here. Bandages wrapped him like memory, evidence of a world that hadn't let him go. Not yet. Vaylith sat nearby, not adorned in glyphs of caste or symbols of command. Those had been stripped, not by punishment, but by purpose. What remained was her, raw, unfiltered, unchanged, and yet completely transformed. She no longer watched him. She waited with him. Around them, the world was quiet. Not the silence of suppression, but of rebirth. The old systems had collapsed. The circle fractured. Across the cities, psychic barriers had begun to lower, not by decree, but by choice. They were no longer fragments of forbidden contact. They were the center of something new. Elias tried to speak, but she only nodded, understanding without language, not caretaker, not subject equal. Whatever they had broken, it had cleared the ground, and from the ashes, something waited to grow. Not perfection, not peace, but truth. The high circle stripped, her name from record. No title, no caste, no future, and yet her image remained. The moment she shielded the human, flesh before flame, thought before law, replayed endlessly across whispered threads and unauthorized feeds. No edits, no voiceover, just the truth of it. They called her the one who felt. Among the young, something began to shift. Not rebellion, not yet, but recognition. The psychic archives overflowed with quiet signals, art resurfaced, dreams shared. Questions once punishable now posed aloud. They didn't want to dismantle the structure, they wanted to feel inside it. The emotive reclamation had no leaders, no manifesto, only momentum, and at its heart stood a pariah, unapologetic, unbroken, unforgettable. She had not sought to become a symbol, but symbols rise in silence, and hers pulsed now through every unshielded mind. It rose from the soil like an apology, stone laced with bioglass, circuitry woven with living vine. No banners, no shields, just a single sign etched in 2 scripts. Contact continues. The outpost was fragile, not in structure, but in purpose, half-staffed by humans, half by Ivalari, all bound by one rule, no shielding. Minds remained open, emotions raw, mistakes would happen, but dialogue would follow, no containment, only connection. Elias co-directed, no longer a specimen, no longer an intruder. Valith stood beside him, not forgiven by the circle, but not forgotten either. She bore no rank, yet held more influence than any ruling caste had in generations. Tension shimmered through the corridors. Trust was earned daily, sometimes hourly. But every time Elias laughed, an Ivalari listened. Every time Valith flinched from an old memory, a human reached out, and Luraith responded. The walls breathed. The light pulsed in harmony. Psychic fields once dormant began to stir again, not from trauma, but curiosity. They called it neutral. Ground, but it felt like beginning, not peace, not yet, but something just as powerful. Hope. She no longer slept across the compound, shielded in solitude. She chose his chamber now, not out of duty, not for study, but for comfort. No psychic grids monitored their breathing, no scans tracked the stillness between them. They slept close, tangled in quiet rhythms of trust. Not lovers, not anomalies, just 2 minds learning how to rest. Elias recorded the shift in his journal, fingers shaking with something he hadn't known he missed, peace. Not silence, not escape, just the warm certainty that someone remained when the lights dimmed. She curled beside him, not as a scientist dissecting anomalies, but as someone no longer afraid to feel them. What had begun in containment had become connection, and the bed that once held a prisoner now held a partner. The journal bore its title with quiet irony, Specimen 113H's Findings. Inside, no graphs. No diagnostics, only memory and meaning. He wrote of Valith, not as anomaly, not as threat, but as the bravest being he'd ever known. Not for shielding him, not for defying her kind, but for choosing to feel. She called me Specimen. He penned ink-trailing warmth. But I think I was studying her all along. What he found wasn't data. It was hope. And hope, like emotion, like love, could no longer be quarantined. Progress does not erase resentment. While new voices rose, older ones grew sharper in silence. Commander Therix no longer held the High Circle's mandate, but power, once claimed, does not vanish. It waits. Stripped of office, he retreated into memory, into doctrine, into legacy. There he found others. The old guard did not march or chant. They murmured, of purity, of structure, of the days before chaos was coddled. They spoke of divergence like a sickness. They called it emotive contamination, a rupture, a treason of the soul, and they watched the outpost, half human, half Ivalari, all blasphemy. It became a beacon not just of potential, but of threat. To those who clung to silence, emotion was not progress, it was infection. Plans formed in darkened chambers, alliances reawakened in old blood, and deep beneath the surface of fragile peace, something stirred. Not the planet, but those who had once ruled it. The circle had cracked, but not shattered. Not yet. The child's eyes shimmered, not with light but feeling. Echoes of emotions once forbidden pulsed behind that gaze. Wonder, doubt, hunger for understanding. The reactivation had worked. Fragile, partial, but undeniable. They sat beside her, legs folded like petals, voice soft as breath. Why him? Not. A challenge, a question as ancient as change. Valith didn't answer immediately. Words were clumsy with truths like these. But the child waited, not for explanation, but meaning. He felt everything, she finally said, and didn't run. Not from pain, not from us. She touched her chest, where once there had only been rhythm, now there was ache. Memory. Bond. He let me hurt. He let me heal. The child nodded, not because they understood, but because they wanted to. History would. Call it divergence, but she had called it beginning. And the child? They called it hope. The words didn't rise in defiance. They descended, soft, unshaken, because he didn't fear feeling, even when it hurt. Not defiance, not doctrine, just truth. In that single breath, the weight of centuries shifted. What the Evalari had severed to survive, he had carried into their world unshielded, fragile, whole. He had bled and wept and stayed, not to save them, to know them. Her voice echoed through the network, silent and seismic. Feeling wasn't the flaw, it was the bridge. And now, through her, they remembered how to cross it. The sky was not silent. It shimmered, each star a breath held in the lungs of the cosmos, each pulse a question, yet unanswered. Above Luraith, the heavens stretched like a neural map, arteries of possibility carved across the dark. Some worlds were charted, documented, claimed. Most were not. Their names had been forgotten or never spoken at all, but they were watching. Waiting, Luraith listened. Its psychic field, once dormant, now tingled like skin before a storm. The planet remembered pain and chose curiosity. What stirred below would not end here. The outpost, the defiance, the bond, they were only the first note in a song that would echo across void and time. Because emotion, once reawakened, is never still, it seeks. And out there in the vastness beyond language and war were stars waiting not to be conquered, but understood. The star map flickered, casting galaxies across his face. She stood beside him, no titles, no restraints, not a subject, not a scientist. Just two minds aligned by pain, shaped by defiance, tethered by choice. This time, they didn't observe the unknown, they entered it together. He closed the journal with fingers scarred by survival but steadied by trust. She once called me Specimen, the final entry read. Now, in her dreams, she calls me Anchor. Not a title, a tether, not an ending, a beginning, and this time they dream together.